Now we can go. So we're going to apply gloves. Make sure that the equipment that we're utilizing is properly calibrated. We'll talk about that in a sec. There's no purpose for doing an analysis if the piece of equipment we're using isn't in calibration. It's garbage in, garbage out. Again, we want to mix the specimen. We want to eject the very beginning of it to make sure there's no clots. Prepare the analyzer for a sample as far as making sure that it's operational and not doing some other business. We're going to inject the sample. Most blood gas analyzers don't require very much blood at all to do the actual analysis. We're going to sample somewhere on the order of 2 mLs, but it's going to only need really about a half a ml to actually do the sample. Get our results. We're going to flush the system once we're done, because we don't want that old stagnated, that blood that's sitting in there to remain in there. You want to flush it out into a waste bottle. And then maybe not. Sure, as soon as I hit it, it goes ahead and advances it. Well, the slide says something about why do we evacuate the very beginning. The first drop or so is that we want to make sure that there's no clots in it. Come on back here. Okay. Two devices we use. We use the blood gas machine to measure the pH, the PCO2 and PO2. And from that we derive some calculated values. We also will measure on the CO oximeter the hemoglobin level as well as the various levels of saturation of those, and derive a total oxygen content. The two that are there that you may not be familiar with up to this point in time. First of all, the total CO2, the TCO2. If you look at an electrolyte panel, you'll see it'll have the sodium, the chloride, the potassium, and the total CO2. We can also read the total CO2 off of the blood gas analyzer. The total CO2 is, as the name implies, the total amount of carbon dioxide being carried in the blood. We know that part of that is bicarbonate, part of it is also dissolved. So you can look at an electrolyte panel and have a rough idea of, by looking at this, what the bicarbonate level is. Okay? Because the vast majority of CO2 is being carried as bicarbonate, right? The other one, the BE, stands for base excess, and it basically is an assessment of how much buffering power you have. So if you remember, a buffer is a substance with which absorbs hydrogen ions and therefore reduces the amount of acidosis that is present. Okay? So the more buffering capacity you have, the better chance you have of handling a sudden change in pH. Okay? It's called base excess, and its normal value, as we'll see, is from +2 to -2. Okay? So a negative base excess is kind of a weird way of saying that. Why not just call it a base deficit? But basically, when you have a negative value, it means that you have a shortage of buffering capacity. If I have a positive value, I have excess buffering capacity. This value, the base excess, and the bicarbonate correlate very, very well. Since the primary buffer is bicarbonate, the base excess is going to give us a handle that says that there's that much there. So if the bicarb is up, chances are the base excess is up. Same is true if the bicarb is down, base excess is down. Okay? All right, two types of analyzers that we're going to encounter while we're doing our clinical rotations through the hospital. One is a benchtop. That would be in a specified lab, and one is a portable, and as the name implies, it can be taken to the patient's bedside. I don't know why you are slower than slow. Give me a second here. Turn off that. Okay, don't let me turn it off. I don't care. All right, so this is an example of a benchtop unit where we would end up having a little access panel door that would open up and we'd be able to insert our sample. Again, as the name implies, it sits in the lab at all points in time. The key part I want you to remember about this one is that it has reusable electrodes. So the pH electrode, the PCO2 electrode, and the PO2 electrode are semi-permanent items that we would do maintenance on as far as cleaning them and doing remembraning and stuff like that. The downside is that they're very sensitive to clots, and there's a lot of maintenance and management time involved as far as caring for these. There's also a lot of quality checks, and we'll talk about those as we go along. The analyzer itself, the actual machine, is quite expensive, somewhere on the order of probably $25,000, $35,000. And there's lots of cleaning and calibration supply, so there's lots of other stuff that needs to go with that. Some of the other supplies that you may need for that benchtop, but you don't need for the portable unit. We need calibration solutions and calibrating gases because we're going to do periodic calibrations to make sure the device is operating correctly. We mentioned flush solutions. After each blood gas, we want to flush the system out so it doesn't have anything contaminating it and potentially clotting it up. There's a waste bottle. And water baths, meaning that we keep the electrodes at a constant 37 degrees temperature. So the actual physical electrodes are immersed in a literal water bath to keep them at a constant temperature. Why that's important, I'll get to in a second. Both type of analyzers have these three electrodes. If you remember back from 1085, probably not. Probably put it out of your mind as quickly as you could, but here it is back again. The SANS electrode, which is measuring pH, the Severing House, which is measuring PCO2, and the Clark electrodes. And again, in the benchtop model, they're reusable. On the other hand is a portable unit, where we can carry it to the patient's bedside, just like a glucometer or any other measuring device, and I can go ahead and get my blood gas readings. There's smaller sample size, which is convenient, so we can do both arterial and capillary. Unlike the benchtop, every time we do a blood gas, we use a new little cartridge, and that cartridge has all of the calibration material as well as the electrodes themselves. So we do a blood gas, we take that cartridge and we throw it away. Awesome. So there's no cleaning, there's no maintenance, there's no quality control in the same fashion. The analyzer itself is a lot less expensive, but they get you on the cartridges. So it's kind of like here's a free razor, but you got to buy the razor blades. They get you back on it. And then the panel itself allows us to go ahead and do some various stuff. And when we'll go to actually, because we'll use this analyzer, hopefully, to be able to actually, when you guys do capillary samples on each other, we'll actually have you run the capillary samples through the IRMA. And you can see here's my little sampling port that we would end up having. This is a lure lock cap on it. You just twist the cap off, attach a syringe, boom, you're analyzing blood. So once it's turned on, we're going to go ahead and open the cartridge package. We need to save it because there's some calibration numbers on there that we need to punch into the machine. We'll go ahead and insert the cartridge. It'll go ahead and check the calibration and integrity of the cartridge. It has all of the stuff that it needs to go ahead and calibrate. And while we're waiting for it to calibrate, we can go ahead and input our patient data, patient ID number, whatever. And then when the cartridge is accepted, we can go ahead and inject the blood. And this is an example of just putting in a syringe, or if you're using the capillary collection device, which we will use in the lab, there's a little plunger that you put in there to push the blood into the cartridge itself. Again, in this case, they're disposable. And they have cartridges that measure pH, PCO2, and PO2, or for only another $1 or whatever, we can include sodium, we can include potassium, we can include chloride, we can do BUN, we can do hematocrit, you can do all kinds of extra stuff, but of course each time you add another item, the price of the cartridge goes up. So don't always have all those things available at the bedside. So let's talk about those 3 electrodes again. This is the part that probably is the most confusing of all. The first 2 are potential generating electrodes, the pH and the PCO2, and how they work I'll explain in a second. The third one, the Clark electrode, is a little bit different. It generates a current. So here's what they look like inside the machine, and again they're inside that little plastic cartridge is where the electrodes are. So let's talk about the theory of operation. First of all, the Severing house electrode, which is basically 2 half cells separated by a membrane, and the blood is then placed so they're adjacent to both of them. I'm sorry, Sands electrode. If I said Severing house, I meant Sands. Blah. I don't care that you know that it's a silver chloride, you know, on one side, and it's something on the other. Just know that there's 2 cells. One's a reference, one's a measurement. And what we're doing is we're comparing the voltage that is there potentially between each other. So the reference cell, again, has this mercury chloride. And it produces a constant potential regardless of the pH. The other one is actually looking at what the pH is, and that difference in potential is proportional to how much hydrogen ions are present, and we can measure that difference as a voltage.
Did you say one's a reference, and then what was the other one?
Measurement. One's doing the measurement, one's just there to compare it to it. So it's looking in the difference between the 2. The Severing house electrode, which measures PCO2, is a modification of the Sands electrode. It has the same kind of thing where I have my 2 reference and measurement half cells, and then as CO2 diffuses across, we know that it can it's going to diffuse across into an electrolyte solution that has water, which is going to form carbonic acid, and eventually hydrogen ions will dissociate out. Those hydrogen ions are what is being measured by this modified Sands electrode. That membrane that it diffuses through, this portion right here, is semi-permeable to carbon dioxide, so it allows carbon dioxide to migrate across, mix with water, and eventually form hydrogen ions. The more carbon dioxide is present, the more amount of hydrogen ions you create, the bigger change in pH you'll end up seeing. So it's really measuring pH, but because of that hydrolysis equation, we can reference it as PCO2 with the sample. We'll talk about temperature change in a second. Let me skip that slide. The last one is a Clark electrode, a polarographic electrode, which basically is measuring the amount of current that is created as you have an oxidation reduction reaction. Oh my God, there's that stupid word again. All you need to remember is that it's got 2 different, a platinum cathode and a silver superchloride anode, but again, what we're seeing here is the reduction of oxygen, and that in the process generates a current. And as the current is generated, I can measure how much current is generated, and it's proportional to the partial pressure of the oxygen. So the more current, more PO2 that is present. I don't really care that you know that silver is oxidized at the anode, and there's a flow of electrodes to the platinum cathode, blah. Just know it's an oxidation reduction reaction that generates a current. Okay, let me talk a little bit about temperature, because temperature is a big effect. We are measuring these values at, in essence, body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. Okay. Inside the machine, that water bath is kept at a constant temperature. What we want to do, though, sometimes is input the patient's temperature to say, well, my patient's not at 37, though. They're at 39. How is that going to affect the results? It only takes into account the temperature of the blood. It doesn't talk about the fact that as you get warmer, as you get a fever, your metabolic rate speeds up, so your CO2 production, O2 consumption changes. And you can see the value there. Don't have to memorize it. Okay? But a febrile or a cold patient will make a difference, and the reason why it'll make a difference is because of Gay-Lussac's law. Remember back to Gay-Lussac's talked about temperature and pressure. As the temperature goes up, the partial pressure goes up. That partial pressure will affect our blood gas values also. So what we'll see is that with the temperature being higher, if the patient's temperature is higher than 37, we need to correct for that increase in temperature. Increased temperature, increased partial pressures. As the PO2 goes up and as the CO2 goes up, the pH will fall, and vice versa on the opposite side. So here's an example, and again, what will end up happening is we'll print out the values at 37 and the values at the corrected temperature. And you can see PO2 is a whole lot higher, PCO2 is a whole lot higher, simply because of the change in partial pressure because of the temperature change. And the poor little guy's got a fever. What? Okay, we talked about some of these pre-analysis errors that can happen. So before I even put it into the machine, I can screw it up. I can draw it from the wrong patient. I can have error in the sample. I can have too much heparin in the sample. I can have a clot. I could have drawn venous blood. Okay? I could have mislabeled it. I could have poked myself. Those are all things that happen prior to even an analysis happening. Well, there's lots of errors that can happen during the analysis. I've got a machine that's not being cared for properly. It's not being maintained. It's garbage in, garbage out. Delay in analysis we talked about. If the sample is left to sit on the counter, within that sample there's white blood cells. Those white blood cells consume oxygen, produce CO2. It's going to skew the values there. Splashes or spills, clots, not mixing it well, not accounting for temperature. And then post-analysis, once we're done with the values, we can still have some errors as far as not disposing of the biohazard, not trying to correlate the results to the patient, having the results misinterpreted, not reported to the physician. And we have what are called panic values, that if they're outside this range, we have to contact a physician. It's required. Not posted, and then no follow-up. Just briefly want to talk about CO oximetry, using again that photospectrometer method to be able to scatter light to be able to measure the different species. There is a bedside CO oximeter. I'll just make mention of it, and we'll be done with it. How's that? Okay. This is what the panel looks like. There's a little test chamber that we're going to put a little cuvette into. Here you can see the test cuvette. We're going to go ahead and fill it with blood, place it in there, and just like the CO oximeter, it'll go ahead and run various wavelengths of light. Again, it is a portable bedside, just like the IRMA is. And you can see our little optical window there where the light shines through and the blood collection port. And put it in the machine, and we don't need to worry about that one. Okay. So you should have an idea of how that CO oximeter works, very similar to the pulse oximeter, shining various wavelengths of light to get our values. The other thing you want to remember is that in the presence of smoke or combustion, it's not going to be an accurate reading using a pulse oximeter. It's why we always want to use a CO oximeter. Also, the methemoglobin in the face of nitrates can cause problems also. Here's 3 different devices. That blood gas machine will estimate a saturation. The pulse oximeter will measure a saturation, but it doesn't include carboxyhemoglobin. The best way, if you got a patient who we suspect a high carbon monoxide level, is that we need to do a CO oximeter. I don't know how many times we've kind of covered that point, but I will guarantee you will see at least.
Repeat that one more time.
Absolutely. If we have a patient we suspect has been exposed to carbon monoxide for whatever reason, either a fire or they were found inside a vehicle running inside a closed space, attempt suicide, you want to use a CO oximeter. You don't want to use a pulse oximeter or the saturation that would be derived, not measured, derived from an ordinary blood gas machine, because it can calculate it based upon some tables. I don't want that. So there's a pre-analysis errors, or analysis errors. They're the same thing that was happening with the blood gas machine. Got the same kind of errors you can have for a CO oximeter. Okay, so even though they're 2 distinct machines, they have the similar errors that are involved there. Okay, let's talk about maintenance, and let's talk about some specifics that are involved here. Because you can have the best machine and have the horrible technician, or the best technician and the horrible machine, and it's going to be garbage. I understand you can't read this one very well, so let me go through it slowly. First of all, it's looking at 2 different concepts. One is calibration. Calibration, and I got a nice diagram of this in a bit, but calibration is basically adjusting the machine to the correct value. Okay. Didn't use this example this morning, but I can use it now. Let's say I think my tire is low of air. What do? I use the gauge. I measure the pressure. Oh, it's low. I add some air. What do I do then? I check it again. And I keep adding air until the gauge is where I think it should be. Sound fair? That's what the blood gas analyzer does. It knows it wants to get to a specific point. It's not there, so it does some internal adjustments to get to that point. Quality control is basically being able to evaluate whether or not what we're doing is correct. We use it in the PF lab with that 3-liter syringe. We can do it in our PF lab, or in our blood gas lab also. And they're all part of this big quality assurance program as far as how we can make sure that our blood gas machine is operating correctly. This is just talking about there's some oversight that is done. The one that most people use are the College of American Pathologists, and they will be, just like the Joint Commission will come in and say that the hospital's doing a good job, these guys come in and say your lab is doing a good job. In most cases, if you have CAP certification, pretty much all cases, if you have CAP certification, Joint Commission won't even look at your laboratory stuff. They'll say you guys are doing good. So it's an independent agency. Why do we want to do that? Well, we're making life and death decisions based upon these numbers. Kind of would be a good idea to make sure that the numbers are real, right? And if it's not, then we need to figure out what's wrong with the picture. Why is it the machine not being maintained? Is it the clinician who's doing the sampling not qualified, etc.? So there's some policies and procedures and proficiency tests that are done of us. We got to have a certain qualification. You just don't want, somebody who was selling shoes yesterday to be told, yeah, just squirt some blood in that machine and you're fine, right? Needs to be something else going on there. Then there needs to be a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to do on a periodic basis. Let's go through them. First of all, we're going to do some daily or periodic maintenance. If there's a battery that needs to be changed, or a solution that needs to be changed, or a calibrating gas that needs to be changed, or the waste container is getting full, I need to empty that out, and various other stuff. Changing the membranes that are on the electrodes, those semi-permeable membranes may need to be changed, or the electrode itself may need to be changed. And we keep a log of it. When was the last time we emptied the waste bottle? Oh, it's been 4 days. I'm going to make a bet that that's probably overflowing, right? And if we do any maintenance or any repair or any other involved process, we're going to document it so that we have a log of everything that we're doing to that car. It's kind of like your car. You hopefully have a file that says, when was the last time the oil was changed, so you know it's time. You guys do know that you need to change the oil, right? So with the bench top, those are done at regular intervals, and it also goes ahead and using some known gases and some known solution generates some calibration values and calibrates itself. With the portable analyzer, we said it's inside that cartridge. So every time you pop a cartridge in, it goes ahead and calibrates itself, and then goes ahead and verifies that it's properly functioning. How does the portable unit know what the proper calibration values are? That's what's in this calibration code that is there. It also has a lot number and expiration date. Are ours expired? Oh, there you go. That's why we're using them. There's what is called a 2-point calibration and a 1-point calibration. A 2-point, as the name implies, means I'm looking at the pH, PCO2, and PO2 at 2 different points. And I'm calibrating it to a low point, and I'm calibrating it to a high point. 1 point only just, as the name implies, novelly, just picks one value and calibrates it to that one value. So here's an application of, let's see, John Dalton's law. If I know the barometric pressure and I know the concentration of the gas that I am using, CO2 and O2, I can determine what the partial pressures should be. Right? Just by multiplying barometric pressure times the fractional concentration of the gas that I'm using, I can determine the partial pressure. We're going to use that then to calibrate it, because it's going to find a line there, that purple line that shows what the pre-calibration response is. So this is what the measured value is seeing now for that percent of gas. It knows that the red line is where it needs to get to. So what does it do? It internally goes ahead and tweaks it a little bit until it gets to that point. Okay? That's a 2-point calibration, a high point and a low point. And we typically do a 2-point calibration every 4 hours, and a 1-point is done prior to every blood gas. So that's calibration. Now I want to make sure that my machine is working right by using some known values, what we call liquid quality control, or it can actually be done with an electronic also. And these are used to make sure that it's operationally operating correctly. These are examples of some liquid quality control. They're in a little glass vial, and there's 3 levels that are there. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then there's a little ampule cover that you would use to break the ampule. That's glass, literally. And if you're using your hands to do it, chances of you getting cut's pretty high. So there's a little rubber cover that you can put on it to prevent damage. There's 3 levels of quality control that we're going to run. One is what we're going to call an acidotic level, one is an alkalotic level, and one is normal. Wow. And then we can log these. Let's get that one. And you can see from the values, the pH again is acidotic, alkalotic, or normal. And also then the PCO2 and the PO2 have various ranges also for those values. What the hell is kPa? Kilopascals. Why do you care about that? I have zero idea. There's a chart that'll actually convert that to millimeters of mercury, which is what we're used to reading. All right. So we're going to do this quality control every shift with 3 levels for pH, PCO2, and PO2. So we're basically getting 9 different values.
You said every shift,
3 values. Acidosis, alkalosis, and normal. So we'll get 3 values. We'll get 3 values of PO2, 3 values of CO2, and 3 values of pH. We're then going to go ahead and plot it on a piece of paper. Each day we mark in a little data point. Here we are today, here we are today. And it looks like this. What this is showing, this is called a Levy-Jennings chart, and I guarantee you'll see these on your boards. I have a midpoint. I have 1 standard deviation below and above, and 2 standard deviations below and above. Again, standard deviation is a statistical term talking about how much variance you have from that middle point. Now, if you notice, they're kind of all over the place, aren't they? And that's what you want to see. You want to see a random nature where it's above the mean, below the mean, kind of bouncing all over again. Okay? That's the randomness of statistical variance. Here's an example. It's called a trend, where I end up seeing it's kind of leaning in one direction and heading in that direction. It's not all over the place. It's not on both sides of the mean. Rather, it's going kind of up. What is that telling us? That's telling us there could be a problem. Okay? So this is the way we can identify when our machines may need to have some maintenance done, because I'm seeing some error. We'll talk about that again in a sec. Here's another type of error that you end up having. It's called a mean shift. One mean shift. Oh, no, bad joke. What if this is my normal, what my expected mean is? Can we now identify that maybe that's moved up? That instead of being above and below the natural mean, it's above and below a new mean? That means something. Oh. Here's another one. Not only going up, 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 it's actually outside the 2 standard deviations. And we're going to call that out of control. It's like when your child has, there you go. Need I say more? So what's happening here? Nothing. That's what we want to see. Some above the mean, some below the mean, but all within 2 standard deviations. This is good. What about this one? Most of them are above and below the mean, just kind of there. We call this a random error.
Does that indicate a problem?
Could indicate nothing. Could just be a random error. Statistically, you're never going to be perfect, right? You're going to have that one pharmacology test where you don't do... It's a random error, okay? So what do? We just repeat the quality control. Because it could just be that for whatever reason there was just a smudge on something or something. Again, this is an example of a trend, and it may mean that we need to do some maintenance, especially when it exceeds 2 standard deviations. Here's another mean shift where most of the points are now below the natural mean, and maybe I need to look at something else going on. So those are called Levy-Jennings charts, and they're used for quality control to identify when my machine is starting to get out of whack. And what I want you to know, mean shift, trend, random error, normal variance. But that's not enough. But wait, there's more. A couple times a year, what we'll do is we'll get a specimen from that College of American Pathologists. It's a mystery sample. We don't know what it is. So we run it on our machine, send the results back to the CAP, and CAP will send us a letter saying, hey, you guys are doing good. Or, ooh, we got a problem here. Okay? So it's kind of an outside testing agency telling us if we're good. It's called a proficiency test. It's a blind test. Stevie Wonder administered. No, I'm just kidding. Then there's twice a year we'll do some control specimens where they have multiple controls to see if we're in just like the quality control we do daily. These are done also. And there's also some multiple machine analysis. If I have 2 blood gas machines that I have operational at the same time, and sometimes it's one that we're running in the ICU and one that lab is running in the lab, we'll take a series of samples and run them on both. And it's kind of comparing, you know, us to them, but are we all in the same range? And there's all the documentation, and we talked about the report log saying how we identified some problem and how we fixed it. Yeah. Let's talk a little about classification, and we'll call it a day. But how about a video first?
Indicator off. Away you go. Take your hand off the wheel. Fumble around for your bag. Don't forget to take your eyes off the road. Right. Grab the phone. Bring it around to the front. Say hello. Get distracted by the conversation.
Hi.
Veer over to the left. Up onto the footpath.
Oh.
Excellent. Now into the oncoming traffic. Don't use your indicator.
If you need to talk or text, pull over in a safe place. Drive safe. Phone safe.
Oh boy. All right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think you guys, how many people still feel uncomfortable with blood gases? Anybody want to volunteer? No? Okay. Good. Just like Lori had on her test in 1050, you'll get 5 blood gases. You get partial credit for knowing the acid-base status, partial status for describing the compensation present, and partial points for oxygenation. Okay. So the left-hand side, all those we're good with, right? Base excess plus or minus 2. Venous, I'm not worrying so much about. The PVO2 and the SVO2 we'll refer to back periodically, but for right now, I'm not as well concerned with it. There's websites out there. Nothing is better than mine, of course, but I'm just biased. We know that as from a chemist standpoint, 7.0 is considered neutral. Our blood is a little bit on the alkaline side at 7.35 to 7.45. And there are certain pH ranges where you're really pushing the envelope. Less than 6.8, greater than 7.8, it's going to be hard to come back from those. So we know that the pH is the balance between the kidneys and the lungs, regulating the amount of base and acids. And we know there's a 20-to-1 ratio with a normal pH between the bicarbonate level and the carbonic acid level. Keeping that bicarb 22 to 26 and our PCO2 35 to 45. There are two types of acids that we encounter in the blood, in the human body. One is called a volatile acid. And there's only one volatile acid. It's carbon dioxide. It's a byproduct of the metabolism of carbohydrates, and we produce a ton of it. Well, we produce 13,000 millimoles per liter, but it's a ton. Okay? The only way we can remove CO2 is by ventilation. And we know that when ventilation is impaired, CO2 clearance is impaired. Hypoventilation, hyperventilation, right? Don't worry about this slide. I'm not punishing you yet. I'll let Lori do it next fall. Okay? But let me just point out, the body actually is quite mathematical, despite the fact that you wish it wasn't. And I can predict how much pH change there will be simply by how many torr change in PCO2 I see. For every 10 torr increase in PCO2, there's a 0.08 decrease in pH. Well, we don't want to worry about that now. That's math. Lori will get you in the fall. The other type of acids that are present are what we're going to call non-volatile. Non-volatile means that they are not excreted by the lungs. They're only excreted by the kidney. And just like CO2 and the volatile acid was created by the metabolism of carbohydrates, when we metabolize fats and proteins as energy, we create either ketones or, in the case of protein metabolism, we create some other acids, sulfuric and phosphoric. Not as much, but it's still there. What comes into problems is when we have a lot of these abnormal. When we talk about the metabolic acidemias, these are some examples. Remember back to A&P and the weird situation you had when you did not have oxidative phosphorylation and you end up having to go the anaerobic pathway in the Krebs cycle. You created lactic acid from non-oxygen anaerobic metabolism. Breakdown of excess breakdowns of fats that you may see in situations where sugar is not available. We have an increased amount of fats that are broken down. They form keto acids, like diabetic ketoacidosis. And the last one having to do with the fact that when the kidneys become impaired as far as their clearance ability, their job is to clear wastes, BUN creatinine. When it can't be done, then you end up having some acidosis created from that one also. It's called azotemia. The most significant base we have as far as who can do the buffering, we talked about it being bicarbonate. That's the primary agent that is there, but there are some other buffering systems, the ammonium system, the phosphate system, and actually one of the best buffers is hemoglobin inside the erythrocyte. If you remember back that CO2 picture, CO2, when it was dissociated into the cell in the presence of carbonic anhydrase, it ended up forming bicarbonate ion, which then went out with the chloride shift. Well, that extra hydrogen ion that was sitting there then is buffered by the hemoglobin molecule. This stuff just don't go away, right? So the first question is always, what side of the pH range are we dealing with? Are we dealing with an acidotic pH like 7.25 or an alkalotic one like 7.55? Then we got to ask ourselves who caused it. Is the alkalosis a loss of an acid or is it a gain of a base? And vice versa with an acidosis. So here we end up seeing the 7.12, 42, and 13 for a bicarb. The 13 bicarb is the one that's causing the acidosis. In the second example, the PCO2 is the one that's causing the acidosis, and the respiratory alkalosis and a metabolic alkalosis. Okay? I think we're pretty good at that, gauging what's causing the acidosis. The big problem is the compensation. That's the stumbling block for a lot of people when they first come across blood gases. We know that if I have a metabolic problem, it's got to be the other system, the respiratory system, that compensates for it, and vice versa with the respiratory problem. We know that the respiratory compensation is fast, where the metabolic compensation is very slow. Uncompensated means that the thing that should be doing the compensation has not budged. It's still within its normal range. Partially compensated means that it's moved out of its normal range, but it still has not returned to a normalized pH. And fully compensated is what we see with our chronic COPD patient who has an elevated PCO2 because of ventilatory impairment, but his bicarb has risen right along with it, so the pH is normal. And there we can see some other things as far as who's doing the compensation and how they end up doing it. Whether it's uncompensated because the CO2 hasn't changed. It's partially compensated because the bicarb has moved outside of its normal range. And it's fully compensated in the third example because now my pH is back to normal. Mixed problems. We haven't covered them up to now, but it's pretty straightforward. Take a look at that example. If I have a pH of 7.25, acidosis, alkalosis? Acidosis it is. Will a PCO2 of 50 cause an acidosis? Yes. Will a bicarb of 19 cause an acidosis? Oh, great. So now I got both of them screwed up. Does this happen? Yeah, a lot of times. So I have a mixed acidosis. I don't have to say the compensation because there is no compensation. The thing that should be compensating is broken too. Right? Yeah. So just mixed acidosis is sufficient. Okay. I am not going to talk about this. I'll let Lori deal with it when she comes to COPD, but let me just kind of give you a primer. Say I have a COPD patient, long-standing COPD, okay? His bicarb has climbed up to, say, 36 because his PCO2 has risen to 62. pH is normalized under normal conditions. But he develops a pneumonia. He develops an acute exacerbation where now he has a superimposed pneumonia on top of his chronic disease. He becomes a little hypoxemic. What's he going to do? What's your body's response to hypoxemia? It's going to try to increase his respiratory rate, try to breathe faster. So this first blood gas is what we end up seeing. It looks like an uncompensated metabolic alkalosis, right? It's not. It's a acute respiratory alkalosis superimposed on a chronic ventilatory failure. What? We lied to you. Okay? People don't just have one thing wrong. So, acute respiratory alkalosis superimposed on chronic ventilatory failure. Okay? More on it later. Okay? I won't hold you to it. It's not something that we'll talk about now, but recognize that Lori will definitely touch on it. So there's an example of a mixed acidosis, right? And then it's a partially compensated ones there. I'll assume you're doing okay on those. The same process though. Which side of 7.4? Who's caused the pH variation? And is this other system that's there able to do any kind of compensation? I'm going to breeze through this quickly because there's only one slide really that I want you to know about, and it's this one. You should know how to classify the level of hypoxemia that is present, whether it's normal or whether it's hyperoxemic. Okay? For right now, again, I'm not going to worry about it. Lori will cover it in the fall. But as we age, we lose lung volume. Our FEV1 goes down. It's a natural decline that we end up having, even if we don't have any kind of a respiratory problem or smoking history. as our lung volume goes down, Fick's law says that our diffusing capacity also goes down, because lung volume is part of that. So we end up having PaO2 fall as time goes on. End of discussion. These formulas should not be unfamiliar to you. The alveolar air equation, the PA to PA ratio, small a to big A ratio, the PF ratio, the A gradient. Remember all those? Had them in 1060, had them in 1050. Don't make me go back and pull out those modules. Now, Lori's talking about this bottom one. So what do I do if I have an alteration in oxygenation that's caused because the patient's got bronchospasm or an asthmatic attack? Well, we'll find there's beta agonists we can use to go ahead and treat that, or anticholinergics that we can go ahead and treat that. The other ones, that's all my class. Talking about how we can improve ventilation or oxygenation as need be. We know about the oxygen content formula. That has not gone away either. Oh, here's a fun looking slide. Preload, afterload. Yeah, I remember those. I won't ask you anything on it, guys. Don't worry. But recognize it will not go away. You'll see this again. And what we can do to improve preload. What we can do to improve afterload. If we don't have oxygen, we mentioned, you go through the anaerobic pathway and you create lactic acid. There I've said what I want you to know. And I think that's the only one I had. Yeah. We'll skip these critical thinking questions. Here's an example. On 100%, I have a PO2 of 122. My desired is 80. I go ahead and I multiply 80 times 1 divided by 122, and I find out it's a 0.66 FiO2. Now this was the first equation, yeah. Now the question is, what kind of oxygen delivery device that we have? What's on our little basket of devices that we can use to deliver that FiO2? And we'll find that one of the devices we could use is what's called a partial rebreathing mask. And I think that was all I wanted to do. Yeah. Normally when I do this slide, this is where I end up, it's turning nasty outside. It's actually been nice the last couple of days, so you can't bitch.